Press Amichai Cohen. Abe just got to do the mechanics there. A renowned expert on national security law in Israel and its interface with international human rights law. Professor Cohen received his LLM and JSD at Yale Law School, currently is a senior fellow at the International Democracy Institute in Israel and teaches international law at the Ono Academic College in Israel. We want to express our deep gratitude to Stephen Wilf, Professor Wilf, for arranging this morning's presentation. Professor Cohen is the author of numerous books and articles, including the recent Proportionality in International Humanitarian Law, Consequences, Precautions, and Procedures, published by the Oxford University Press in 2021. His work on the investigation of alleged war crimes was cited in various international reports, including the UN's Independent Commission of Inquiry on the 2014 Gaza conflict. Additionally, Professor Cohen has been a much sought after commentator on the recent International Court of Justice decision. Professor Cohen's comments will be pivotal in helping us understand that Israel is not merely responding to outside criticism with respect to the norms of international law. Rather, Israel has developed its own approaches to guide military conduct in a moral manner based on the historical experience of the Holocaust and the various Israeli wars. Professor Cohen.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure seeing you this Sunday morning. Claims are raised against Israel now regarding the war in Gaza. So we can see stages in the way the world perceived what happened in Gaza. At the first, with the initial shock on October 8th, Israel was seen, of course, as the victim. And the world supported Israel. The latest stage when Israel considered the ground operation, we could see discussions, but basically, at least in Western countries, support of the goal of eliminating Hamas as a legitimate goal. Lately, we see much criticism regarding the way Israel conducts its military operations. And I want to say my conclusion at the beginning. So if people, towards the end, lose some of the attention, then they'll know in advance. My point is, and as was presented earlier, is that there is no conflict in the history of mankind in which no violations of the laws of war were committed. Not even one example. The question, the way we compare states, is regarding the way they confront these violations. What do they do with this phenomenon of soldiers in the field that are faced with difficult situations and sometimes take the wrong decisions? What is the approach of the state? And my claim is that when comparing Israel to all other Western countries, Israel favorably compares to all others because of three institutions or three frameworks that operate in Israel. The first is the Israeli Supreme Court. The second is an independent mechanism for investigating violations. And the third is the spirit of the IDF, the Israeli Code of Conduct, which is based on experience, history, ideology of Israel. All of these together create an atmosphere which rejects violations of the laws of war. Once again, I'm not claiming that no violations occur. In every conflict in human history, violations have occurred. The question is, how does a state confront these? With your permission, I would like to share a presentation. So I'll do my best. Here we go. Just a second here.
No,
Just let me know. Can you see it okay?
yeah, perfect, perfect.
Full screen, and is it
Yes,
moving?
perfect. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So as I said, I'm gonna deal with three issues. First is the international law in Israeli law, and it's the role of the Supreme Court. The second is how Israel investigates alleged violations. And the main issue I want to deal with today is the spirit of the IDF and its sources. So, first of all, when speaking about the international laws of war in Israeli law, so there is the formal point of view. Israel accepts fully the laws of armed conflict into its military operations. So there are mechanisms of education. There are the military advocate general have the unit has lawyers attached to divisions operating on the ground. There is at the helm of the decision making the Israeli Supreme Court. And I want to speak about two examples from the Israeli Supreme Court and the uniqueness of this institution in discussing. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, perfect, perfectly. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. So I had a message that the connection. So the Israeli Supreme Court. So two cases which go to show the uniqueness of the Israeli Supreme Court in intervention in military operation and in enforcing international law. The first, it's a very famous case, the targeted killing case. The question is before the court whether operations of targeted killing where there is a specific terrorist that is targeted, is it legitimate to direct a military operation at a specific terrorist? And the question was never put before any court in the world up until in 2006. The Israeli Supreme Court discussed this issue in the targeted killing case. And Justice Aaron Barak, his last judgment as president of the Israeli Supreme Court before his retirement, gave a landmark ruling, first in the world, in which he said targeted killing are a legitimate form of self-defense against terrorists. He said, as long as the rule of proportionality, so the question of collateral damage of civilians has to be sought, but generally it's allowed under certain conditions. And this was actually a ruling that opened up discussion regarding this question of targeted killing in the entire world. So it's not only that the Israeli Supreme Court preserves international law domestically, it affects the way other states understand international law. It opened up a discussion with the International Committee of the Red Cross, with lawyers in the US Army and in the UK Armed Forces regarding these issues. So this is a first example. A second example is even more interesting, and it's a case in which the court prohibited a military practice. It's the neighbor practice. The neighbor practice was a practice according to which when a military unit wishes to enter a house in which there are people who either terrorists or terrorists and civilians, or it's a house which houses, say, armaments. It's a military target, but there are civilians around it, and the army doesn't want to destroy the house. What they did is they asked a neighbor, or asked is not the correct word, they requested a neighbor to go before the army and warn the people in the house that the army is outside. And in several cases, this caused the terrorists who hid inside the house to shoot the messenger. And a petition was brought to the Israeli Supreme Court claiming that this policy is illegal because it involves civilians in the conflict. The army requests, but actually tells civilians to enter to enter the conflict. Civilians that were outside the conflict are told to be involved in the conflict, and sometimes they were hurt, and the court said, this is illegal, this policy is illegal. So we can see that the Israeli Supreme Court, so that's my first claim. My first claim is that the first level of enforcement on the IDF is the Israeli Supreme Court willing to intervene in military policies, sometimes even in military operations, what's legal and what's illegal. So that's the first layer of protection of the law dealing with when dealing with with armed conflict. The second layer is a domestic mechanism which was created after an incident which some of you might remember. In 2010, there was the flotilla. The flotilla was a group of ships that allegedly tried to break the siege on the Gaza Strip and bring in humanitarian assistance. Of course, it was led by a group that was supported by or connected to Hamas. And Israel, in a commando operation, took control of the ships. In taking control of one of the ships, the Mavi Marmara, there was a conflict, and 10 people were killed. Activists of the organization connected to the Hamas that led the operation. Anyway, what ensued was enormous amount of international pressure on Israel because the flotilla was perceived as a humanitarian operation, and what was created was the Tirkel Commission, an investigation led by Justice Yaakov Tirkel, Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court. And in 2012, he recommended, and this is my point, the second layer of review of Israeli operation. It's the independent inquiries mechanism. So during every armed conflict, and this began in 2014 in Operation 2014 was Protective Edge, I think. Beginning in 2014, in every serious, significant military operation of the IDF, there is an independent mechanism which consists of persons who are not part of the armed forces, an independent commission that reviews all claims of alleged violations of international law by IDF soldiers. In fact, there needs even not to be a specific claim by a Palestinian or an NGO. Sometimes there are claims by allegations by an NGO or a specific Palestinian family. But sometimes it's just something that appears on their screen. So, for example, I know for a fact that in the current war, all the inquiries which one can read in the New York Times regarding specific operations are looked into by this independent mechanism. It's not a criminal investigation in the beginning. So the point is not that every time that there is a claim, immediately there is a criminal investigation. No, what the Turkey Commission created was something which is accepted in many armed forces, but in Israel, I think it operates in the most serious way. It's an independent fact-finding mechanism. So the facts are looked into because a lot of the claims and allegations made against the IDF are made, and IDF soldiers are made for political reasons, are preposterous. So what they do is, first of all, they create the factual background, and they do it in real time. So right now, there is this independent mechanism which looks into issues. And the military advocate general just last week, which the results of the inquiries are presented to the military advocate general, and she decides, right now it's a she in Israel, she decides whether to open a criminal investigation according to these reports. She has already stated that she has decided to open several criminal investigations because several of the inquiries have come. I don't know which. In several of the inquiries, the result was that there is ground for criminal investigation. However, and I want to make this point, it's an important point. Law and law enforcement will never be enough and is not the main mechanism by which the norms that IDF soldiers should follow are enforced. The main mechanism by which values and norms are enforced within the IDF is a document known as the spirit of the IDF, in Hebrew, Ruach Tzahal, the spirit of the IDF. It's something in between law and ethics. It's a claim that in order for soldiers, especially in the lower level, to follow norms and values, one should not speak to them in legal terms, what is allowed and what is prohibited. One should explain and show the importance of the values of the IDF. Now, mind you, the values of the IDF, and I'll show them in a second, are not all connected with the questions of international law of armed conflict and the preservation of the lives of Palestinians. Many of them deal with military operations. So the importance of the mission and the need for professionalism. But a lot of what the spirit of the IDF deals with is the issue of the values that the soldiers IDF soldiers should follow when they are in battle. And the spirit of the IDF went through several stages. The earliest one was in the late 90s. A general, Yoram Yair, and a philosopher and ethics philosopher, Asa Kasher, created the Israeli ethics code or code of ethics. And later, a second committee, once again formed by both philosophers and people with knowledge in ethics in general, and serving officers, some lawyers, perhaps you know Professor Moshe Halbertal was one of the people who wrote The Spirit of the IDF.
Yeah, no,
this is the current thing we have, and I would like, in the few minutes that I have, to speak a little about the spirit of the IDF and its implementation. So first of all, the spirit of the IDF speaks about the sources. So what are the sources of the values of the soldier in the IDF? 4 sources: the tradition of the IDF and its military heritage, the tradition of the Jewish people throughout their history, the tradition of the State of Israel, its democratic principles, laws, and institutions, and universal moral values based on the value and dignity of human life. I think that the way the sources are presented signals something very important. One cannot require a soldier to adopt values just because there are universal values. It's an important thing that there are universal values and that there is international law, of the laws of armed conflict. But this cannot be the only, it even cannot be the main reason for a soldier to adopt a certain way of conducting military operation. It has to be grounded in his own culture, the Jewish culture, in the values of the state, a democratic state, and in the tradition of the IDF. The code then actually draws from very deep sources. It reflects, it does not create new obligations, new values, new norms. It draws on ancient ideas and norms and understanding grounded in the tradition of the Jewish people, in the tradition of the State of Israel, and in the tradition of the IDF. I don't want to speak a lot about the Jewish tradition. It's with regards to the laws of armed conflict. We all know that in the Megillat Esther, right, when the Jews protected themselves, they did not touch the spoils. We all know, or perhaps many of us know, that the Rambam spoke about the rules of siege in his commentary. He has a whole section about how war should be conducted and the limits of war. It's rooted very deeply, I think, in Jewish tradition. I want to speak about something that perhaps is less known, and in the idea rooted in the history of the Zionist movement and of the State of Israel, the idea of purity of arms. The purity of arms was coined, the term was coined by Berl Katzenelson. Berl Katzenelson was the ideologue of the labor movement in the pre-state years. And Berl Katzenelson, who was, wrote on many issues, he said it this way. All translations are my own, so you'll excuse me for the flimsiness, perhaps, of the translation. So he said in a very famous speech he gave at the beginning of not at the beginning, but at one of the peaks of the Arab revolt against the British. This is in the pre-state Israel, in which a lot of Jews were killed because the Arabs did not direct their operations only against the British; they directed them also against Jews. And then the Palmach was created, and the Israelis then began to respond, the Jews began to respond, and then he stated the basic premise. The basic premise is that may our weapons, it should be pure. We learn weapons, we carry weapons, we stand before those who rise to fight us, but we don't want our weapons to be stained with clean blood. So, and this is a very important tradition in the Israeli tradition. And it was embedded in the IDF in a very interesting case in which a poet affected the values of the IDF. So Natan Alterman, who was the most renowned Israeli poet, in November 1948, in the midst of the War of Independence, he writes a song, a poem, Al Zot, on this. And Natan Alterman, it should be understood, he wasn't a poet who wrote for the draw. He was a public figure. He wrote in the most important Israeli newspaper, and once a week he had a column there, and everybody in the first page, and everybody read it. So it was a very important thing. And then this is my translation of the poem. So it's a very unpoetic translation, okay? But you'll explain, you'll understand. And the case he's dealing with is a case of a Jewish soldier who shot an Arab, an elderly Arab, in one of the cities that was conquered, probably in Lod. So crossed the occupied city on a jeep, a bold and armed boy, a lion boy. And in the street, an old man and a woman pushed themselves from fear to the wall. And the boy smiled with milk teeth. I will try the machine gun. And he tried. The old man just covered his face in his hands, and his blood covered the wall. All who were, and I'm skipping a bit, but that's the main point, all who wear the garb of the warrior, and we alongside with them, some in practice and some with the supportive slap, are being pushed in the mattering of necessity and revenge to the domain of war criminals. And this was an extremely influential poem. Ben-Gurion, when he read it, he published it in 100,000 copies, and every soldier received it when he was enlisted. It was sent to high schools all around the country. So the idea that you understand, in the midst of the war, Natan Alterman, the most renowned poem, writes that there are war criminals amongst us, and we should reject them. This became a very important part of the tradition of the IDF. And the last point I want to make is that there is a very, very deep connection between the idea of equality and the idea of treating all persons as equal and democracy. There is a very deep connection. And this deep connection also goes to the idea of treating every human being as um, the idea of human dignity. So every human being deserves to be treated um, in a way that respects his existence. It, of course, appears in the US Declaration of Independence. We all know, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it also appears in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, right? So the state of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, and it will ensure complete equality. And the required result in Israel's Declaration of Independence is that we extend our hands to all neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness, etc., etc. The idea is that a democratic country with democratic values, which treats every human being as equal, necessarily treats with human dignity. The idea you can't treat your enemy, even your enemy, in a way which does not include some respect to the rights of enemy, especially of enemy civilians. So these sources, the human tradition, the state of Israel, and the purity of arms, the tradition of the IDF, are extremely important in creating the spirit of the IDF. Once again, I'm not claiming that this creates a foolproof way that the IDF will, all soldiers within the IDF will necessarily never deviate from the rules. It can't happen. But the spirit of the IDF creates the cultural background for soldiers, and it's a document on which all soldiers go receive extensive training. It creates an atmosphere within the army that is very important for preserving the rules. And you can see that these are the fundamental values in the spirit of the IDF. So after the sources, there are the fundamental values. So defense of Israel, the state of Israel and its residents, patriotism, human dignity. The IDF and our soldiers are obligated to protect human dignity. Every individual is of inherent value, regardless of their ethnicity, religion, nationality, gender, or status. And in the specific values, there are two values specifically relevant. So the value of human life and purity of arms. You can see that the code, the Israeli spirit of the IDF includes many issues which are not necessarily connected to the enemy. Okay, so responsibility, a sense of mission, discipline, professionalism, but two specific values are connected to the idea that the rights and the values deserved by the other party. So human life, and IDF soldiers will recognize the critical importance of human life, a very Jewish, I think, value. And then the purity of arms. So this is the definition of the value of purity of arms. An IDF soldier will only exercise their power or use their weapon in order to fulfill their mission, and only when necessary. They will maintain their humanity during combat and routine times. The soldier will not use their weapon or power to harm uninvolved civilians, prisoners, and will do everything in their power to prevent harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property. Now, everybody who knows something about international law understands that this is an attempt to write the laws of armed conflict, or at least some principles of the laws of armed conflict regarding the protection of civilians into the purity of arms, but it's not presented as international law. It's presented as the idea of purity of arms that draws from the deep traditions of the State of Israel, of the IDF, of democracy, right? It's presented as part of the Jewish tradition. This, once again, does not mean that there are no violations. Of course, as I said, it's important to see the way that the IDF will deal with possible violations. But I think that the way to think about the spirit of the IDF, and with this, I think I'll end my part of the presentation. Of course, I'm open to questions. I think it's like in medicine. You have preventive medicine and you have responsive medicine. Everybody, I think, I assume, since we're speaking with a Jewish audience, that there are lawyers and doctors in the crowd, right? So I know at least one lawyer, but I assume that there are also doctors here. Preventive medicine is usually more effective. And I think the IDF has invested an enormous amount of effort in preventive medicine. And usually, and looking at the history of the cases, because of this enormous amount of investment in preventive ways, by educating soldiers according to the spirit of the IDF, one can assume that if there are violations, these violations are relatively, once again, we can have only a relative assessment since we don't know all the facts yet, but necessarily relatively to other Western countries, the way the IDF conducts its operation favorably compares. So that's it for my short presentation. And I'll be happy.
Can I may I ask you a question? And
Sure.
I apologize, this is a bit open-ended, but how does Israel respond to the ceaseless barrage of international criticism on its operations in Gaza, including, but I don't know if this is a legal question or a general question, obviously the International Court of Justice decision, which I know you've commented on. I mean, what approach can the Israeli government take here? And I apologize again, it's a bit open-ended, but we're all
it's okay
here.
So when one thinks about international law, one has to differentiate, I think, between some institutions and operators or players in the international community, which are anti-Israeli by definition. So we all know that in the UN General Assembly, there is an automatic anti-Israeli majority. It doesn't matter what Israel will do. And so one should differentiate between these and the idea of international law as reflecting shared values that represent something of the way the international community historically, I would say, objectively thinks of certain values. And Israel wants to be part of this community of democracies, which thinks about international law not only as a platform for achieving specific interests, but as representing shared values. That's the basic idea of international law. So, in response to your question, it depends where criticism comes from. If the criticism comes from China or Russia, which we all know how much they respect, quote unquote, international law in the way they operate, then Israel should respond in a political way. So it matters as much as the opinion of Russia matters. It doesn't mean anything in terms of values or norms or international law. It's a question of whose interest is more important here and how to operate within a world in which there are conflicting interests. So that's the way to confront it. However, if the criticism comes from our allies in the United States, specifically in the armed forces of the United States. So, for example, lawyers in the armed forces of the United States or of the UK or of France. And there are claims, and there are sometimes serious claims, regarding specific policies that Israel adopts and claims that these should not be adopted, then this criticism should be taken much more seriously, I think, for two reasons. First of all, the importance of our allies to the way we conduct operation. And second, because not each and every American lawyer, but generally speaking, lawyers within the US armed forces, for example, have many times a similar view of Israelis as to the values that should be implemented during armed conflict. And if they have criticism, then it should be taken seriously, and Israel does take it seriously, I think, generally speaking, without going into this operation. So it varies and depends a lot about what you mean when you say international criticism. Not all criticisms, not all international criticisms were created alike.
Well said. Well said.
I have a question also, Amichai. I mean, every war has its own unique characteristics in terms of these concerns. And what's striking in the Gaza conflict is the amount of property damage that's occurred within the conflict. And if we're talking about spoilage, the taking of terrorist assets, how has property been reconsidered, or how would you think about reconsidering property in light of simply the amount of property that has been destroyed
Yes.
in Gaza? And does it alter the way we're sort of, this is so focused on human life? Does it alter the way we think about these issues?
Yeah, so three comments here. One is that certainly, and as you said, life is more important than property.
Mm-hmm.
And the main attempt of Israel at the initial stages of the war was the idea that Hamas created an enormous human shield in cities in the Gaza Strip, and the only way to operate within these cities militarily is to use a lot of force. And in order not to create catastrophic results in biblical scales, the way to operate was to evacuate the population from Gaza City. And indeed, much of the population was evacuated. However, you are correct that once the population was evacuated, it became much easier for the IDF to use force in a sense that results in the destruction of property. Okay, but the alternative was that many civilians will be killed. So there is some trade-off here. That's the first point. The second point, and in this, no doubt there will be investigation, is that in some cases, because, and I think you're correct, a lot of emphasis has been put on the lives of Palestinians. So as Palestinians, as collateral damage in the sense of the lives of Palestinians, then soldiers in certain cases may have paid too little, or commanders may have paid too little attention to the destruction of property, both in military operation, which is a problem, but the larger problem, and this should be looked at, and I think it is looked at, is that, cases in which soldiers, after they spend time in specific houses, they lit them up or they destroyed them. This certainly, and if there were violations there, they should be looked at. And the third point, I think, is that a lot of the criticism hinges actually on what will happen afterwards. Because it's clear to everyone that Gaza City is not habitable as it is right now. Now, it doesn't matter a lot, whether Israel would have been a little more careful. It's the amount of destruction caused by the fact that the IDF had to fight within a city with an enemy that embedded itself in tunnels below a city. The amount of damage to property requires an enormous amount of rebuilding of the city. And it would have been required even if Israel, even if the IDF was more careful. The question is who will whether Gaza City will be rebuilt, who will rebuild it, in what, even think about, the way to be rebuilt. So if the refugee camps will be rebuilt exactly as they were before the war, the result will be that they will be the breeding ground for terrorist activity exactly as they were before the war. The question is, it's an architectural even question. How to build a city which will not be in which the terrorist cells will not be immediately recreated, and there are solutions and questions, but what I'm trying to say is that rebuilding of Gaza City by itself is a good cause. It's because the way that the Gaza City was built before resulted in the creation of Hamas. So one has to also rethink about the way that the property was used before. But this is just a thought here. I don't have any specific plan regarding this.
That was a very poignant comment, actually. It's not much spoken about, but that's really worthy of a lot of attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this stage? Because it's getting a little late in Israel and still early here. Stephen, any other thoughts?
Well, I would like to ask another question, which is, I was really struck with Amichai's story of Natan Alterman's Azot being distributed en masse by Ben Gurion. And I'm just wondering if there's anything like that today, that we can see that kind of statement really clearly, of red lines. That is there some other way that we've seen this kind of something analogous, even vaguely analogous, to that distribution of Azot?
I think it's not spoken about because politically, I won't say anything about our political leaders. I will, however, say something about the importance, I think, and if I may say the advantages from the case of South Africa versus Israel. So we all know, and this is not the subject of this talk, this is an immensely problematic case. The claim that Israel is committing genocide is absurd. But there was one positive result to this case. And the positive result was that the public atmosphere in Israel was somewhat cleansed of the statements that were made in the initial stages that were extremely problematic. You know, what should we do with Gaza? So, you know, members of Knesset said we should level it. These statements, now, this is, I think, a direct result of the fact that everybody understood that this is extremely damaging in the international community and specifically in the case before the International Court of Justice, these statements. And therefore, the public atmosphere is somewhat cleaner now of these statements. In this sense, there was, now it's not exactly, I'm not exactly answering your question, I think, but there were statements made by politicians that were damaging, and then in response, both the public atmosphere of Israel rejected these statements, and certain politicians, from the prime minister to the chief of staff and to the spokespersons of the IDF, etc., they all said, no, we are following international law, we are conducting our operations according to international law. So it was said clearly in the media in response to this international pressure. Of course, one can always, and one should always think about the Ben-Gurion as a politician who was also able to think about values, and one misses such politicians, I think, not only in Israel but also around the world. But I think some things were said and should have been said.
Stephen, Professor Cohen, this has been truly extraordinary and really very insightful for me personally and for the group. And we thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom with us, and hope we can communicate it all at some point. Thank you so much. Erev Tov.
Thank you very much for having me.
And a personal thank you, Amichai.
And enjoy the rest of your weekend and have a nice day.
You too. I wish you someday would have a weekend, Amichai.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a great American invention that needs to be imported.
Exactly.
Import the weekend, right?
Exactly. Kol Tov. Thank you.